Welcome to this episode of Hear It From a Huskie. I'm Dr. Laurie Fiorenza, and I'm joined by Melissa Godinez and Velia del Fiacco, two English teachers here at Oak Park and River Forest High School. We are here today to talk about accurate and fair grading and how we motivate students through some of our practices in our classrooms. Melissa, I know that you use a practice in your classroom of no zeros. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that and how it motivates your students?
Hi, sure. So first things first, I wanted just to mention the practice that we're referring to comes from a 2004 article by Douglas Reeves called The Case Against Zero, where he talks about grades being disproportionately oriented towards failure, especially on the traditional 0 to 100 scale. Mm-hmm. So traditionally on that scale, 0 to 59 would be considered failing F. The idea is that instead of giving students a 0, for example, not turning anything in for certain assignments, you give them half credit, so a 50, as opposed to a 0, which is still an F, is still a failing grade. However, it makes it so that students are more motivated to then catch up, because then, for example, if it's 10 weeks or even 5 weeks, I would hope it's not to the point where the student gets to 10 weeks, although that sometimes happens. You get assignments, your average is a 2% in the class, and you're trying to pass. A 2% is not as motivating, especially when the borderline to pass is a 60. A 55 or a 52 even is much more attainable for students that are struggling. So this neutralizes the negative aspects of grades for students. They are likely to want to then participate in the makeup and catch-up process.
That makes sense.
So what I do in my classroom is I have two categories in Skyward: the formative tasks and summative tasks. Summative tasks are worth 70% of their grade, and formatives are worth 30%. When it comes to formative tasks, these are the day-to-day tasks, homework, classwork, prep assignments that take you to the summative. They can get zeros on this, and they do, if they're not submitted without any form of communication. So that means the student was in class, they engaged in instruction, and they did not follow through with completing the tasks and submitting it. That does earn a 0. However, even with formatives, I do have some students who need additional time, need one-on-one support, either because they have accommodations or they don't. Sometimes students just need more help with certain tasks. As long as those students communicate to me that they need that extra support, I am okay with not giving them a 0 until we get that support that they need. If after a few days I've followed up and nothing is happening and they're not following through, at that point the grade can turn into a 0, but immediately I do not give those students 0s. For summative tasks, I do not give 0s at all. There is a 50% if the task is not turned in, and there is a 60% minimum for a valid attempt on that task. And the way that I plan my units, students are working on summative tasks in class in front of me, with me, for up to 3 weeks. So It makes it really hard for students to show up the day the summative is due and not have anything.
Okay.
They have something. And to me, that is a valid attempt. And so as long as there is evidence that students are trying, maybe they, for example, I had a student who in the last summative did 3 paragraphs instead of 5. They did not complete the full essay, but the valid attempt was there. Okay. And I graded that valid attempt as a summative. When doing grading practices like the one I just described, it also makes it so much easier to get students to want to revise their work and earn better grades for that. And that, to me, is incredibly motivating. That shows motivation. It shows that my students are motivated, but it also motivates me as their teacher.
Yeah. Melissa, before we shift, can you just talk a little bit about what have you noticed in your classroom with your students' grades, with your students' ability to complete assignments, and their ability to advocate for needing an intervention or support? What have you noticed?
In terms of communication, like their their skill, their ability to advocate is so much better than in the years past.
Really?
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Like it was immediate, like second week of school. The freshman team, we made like a little email lesson, like trying to teach students early on how to email teachers. And it worked. I've gotten really good open communication with students. And that is different than in the years past.
Okay.
That has opened a lot of doors to like even building stronger relationships with students, which I think is one of the key pieces in having, there's a level of vulnerability that comes from having to admit that you need help.
Absolutely.
And then having to then say, well, gosh darn it, I am failing a class. I need help, Ms. Godinez. Can you help me with this summative? And I think that has really helped in my class.
That's amazing. Velia, you also engage in some practices that are designed to motivate students, and you require students to revise their work. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about that, and also what you notice in your classes and in your students as a result of requiring them to revise?
Yeah, so what Melissa talked about was, the revision practice when it comes to summative assessments. But we also have students revising their formative assessments as well. So by the time we get to a summative assessment, they've already had that practice on how to revise, how to get from point A to point B, how to make one paragraph, move from a rough draft to a final draft. So for example, in my class, if I have students writing a CER paragraph, right, we'll take a look at the original CER paragraph that they've written. And students, if they're at the point that they could self-assess and go through that paragraph on their own, they could maybe look at it and say, okay, my claim needs to be stronger. I didn't blend my evidence. I forgot to cite whatever it is, right?
Okay.
If they're not at that point, like at the beginning of the year, I had to tell them, like, let's take a look at your original paragraph. Let's see what is weakened, or what is weaker, I should say, what needs strengthening, what needs correcting, or what's just missing, right, from this paragraph. And then on a separate document, or maybe sometimes on a separate slide, or even on a separate part of a document, we rewrite that paragraph and we go through that revision process in a series of broken down steps.
Okay.
So, maybe day one, we're going to practice rewriting our claims. We're going to make sure that we all have a strong claim to start out with. Day two, we're going to make sure that our evidence actually supports the claim, or we're going to make sure that we've all blended and cited our evidence properly. Day three, I'm going to walk you through the reasoning process again. Let's go back and let's rewrite our reasoning. Let's make sure that it's strong and then it's actually explaining how the evidence, supports the claim. Then by the end of that process, we might dedicate a whole week to this, but by the end of that process, students have their original paragraph that they wrote, and then they have their new paragraph that they wrote, and they can see their progress.
Absolutely.
Which that in itself is motivating.
Yes.
Because, they look at what they've done and they're like, okay, not only am I actually capable of writing a much stronger CER, but like, look at what I've learned. Like, look at what I've done to actually, kind of show that I've improved in a skill. Another way that I have my students that I hate to use the word force, right? But that I require my students to revise a skill. Sometimes it'll be a much smaller skill that I'll assign, via Google Classroom, right? Like maybe it's just writing a theme. And let's say, 60% of the kids, they nailed the skill, they got it, but I've got, 40% of those kids that they didn't get it, they need to try it again. Sometimes what I'll do is on Google Classroom, there's a feature where you can just assign an assignment to specific students, not to the whole class.
Okay.
And I'll repost that assignment and I'll only assign it to the students that need to redo it.
Okay.
So those kids will open Google Classroom and they'll see, January 18th revision assignment, right? And it's just assigned to those kids that need to redo it. So they'll go on Google Classroom, and it's, a way that I could also reassign it without calling kids out, right? I'll just say, hey, by the way, if you look on Google Classroom and you see that there's a revision assignment there, that means that you have to go back and you have to redo it.
That's such great differentiation too.
Right. Yeah. And what I like about that too is that, sometimes if I just return an assignment to a student and say like, redo this assignment, they'll just keep turning back the same assignment. But if I say, now look, there's a whole new assignment that you have to do. It's
Yeah.
the same assignment as last time, but this time you need to try it again, apply the feedback, turn it in again. That way also they could look at their old assignments, right?
Okay.
The original assignment, they could look at the revision assignments. And once again, they could see the difference between the two.
Okay.
And they feel a little bit better again about the improvements that they're showing there.
Absolutely.
And I guess the differences that I've noticed, or what I've noticed since I've, implemented these practices, is that students feel more confident, I think, in their
Okay.
writing. They feel better knowing that they'll have a chance to revise. And as we've been doing this throughout the year, they've become a little bit better at self-assessing, right? So I mentioned before that, at the beginning of the year, I had to be like, look, this is what needs strengthening. This
Yeah.
is what's missing. This is, what we did wrong. At this point in the year, I have a lot of students looking at their own work and being like, I know what I didn't do here. I know I forgot to blend, or I know I did the wrong punctuation here. I realize now that this isn't a claim. So forcing kids to do, or requiring kids, I should say, to do the revision process over and over again, it makes them a little bit better at self-assessing. They become a little bit more, I guess, independent in their own work. They kind of take charge of their own work, and overall they just become more confident.
Yeah, it sounds like both of you are using a number of practices in your classroom that not only hit at accurate and fair grading, but differentiation, and really are centered in that growth mindset. Yeah. So thank you, ladies, for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hear It from a Huskie. Stay tuned for more from our Huskie faculty making an impact.